producer, Alex Sizemore-Smale, who will introduce.
To introduce Mark Allen. Mark is an educator, artist, and curator. He earned his MFA in Visual Arts from Cal Arts, and he is an associate professor at Pomona College. He is also the founder and executive director of the Machine Project, which is a community and creative space in Echo Park, which has created a space for interdisciplinary art projects, and has also been involved in building a stronger artist community in the Los Angeles area. So I'm very excited to welcome him.
Thank you so much. What an amazing list of visitors you have, and I'm flattered to be part of it. Oh, my wife's here. Hi. I'm going to turn off the lights because I haven't done public speaking in a while, and I'm kind of scared, and also I think it will help the slides show up. So. Oh, thank you. Great, let's do this. Okay, so I want to start the talk by asking a question, which is, what is this? No. 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 This is fungus. Yes, excellent. So what we're looking at here is a mushroom farm. Does anybody notice anything about this mushroom farm? It is a factory farm. It's indoors. And you'll notice that the mushroom farmer is wearing kind of a hazmat suit. And the reason for this is not that the mushrooms are toxic, but everything else is toxic to the mushrooms. So in order for them to grow, they have to be in a sterile environment. Otherwise, other molds or things will colonize their growth medium. Here's another image of mushrooms. What is different between this image and the first image? I'm sorry, I teach undergraduates, so you're being subjected to that. No, not at all. Capitalism is responsible for most problems, but not this one. These mushrooms, I'm sorry? They're outside. Yes, it's not a sterile environment. It's pretty much the opposite of sterile. And in fact, there are many species of mushrooms that were not able to grow in those kind of conditions without this ecosystem that they emerge out of. And the mushroom we're looking at here is actually a very successful mushroom. It's a mushroom that I'm sure its mushroom mom is very proud of. This is the fruiting body of a honey mushroom specimen growing in Oregon. This is the world's biggest organism by area at 2,200 acres, and it's almost 2,400 years old. And I like to open with this because the thesis of my talk is basically that being an artist works best when you try to be more like the forest mushroom and less like the factory mushroom. And that there's a lot of aspects of the art world which kind of push in both directions. And I'm advocating for thinking about yourself as part of an ecosystem. So I got interested in this idea after I went to grad school, and then afterwards, a good thing and a bad thing happened to me, and they were the same thing. So I got a job as a computer programmer, and I kind of looked around at my life, and I wasn't really having much intellectual and cultural life. And even though half the people I went to grad school with drove me nuts or I threw up on, I really missed having that kind of group brain around me that those of you who are students now are, I'm sure, luxuriating in. So after a couple small projects with artist spaces, I rented a place in Echo Park, and I created this place called Machine Project. This is one view of it. This is another view of it. And the idea with Machine Project is it's a machine for making culture, so that you would have as inputs the public and artists and different kinds of resources, and out of that you would produce new ideas and new philosophies and ways of thinking about the world. Part of that is thinking about what are those inputs. So what is a public? Something that I experienced I mean, this was a while ago. This is like 14 years ago, so I think LA has changed a lot since then. But something I experienced was that I was very interested in science, so I would go to science talks, and it was sort of other scientists at Caltech. Or I would go to poetry readings, and it was like the 9 other poets who wanted people to come to their reading the following week. And so I felt like those were really amazing communities, but I was curious as to what would happen is if you had an audience that was poets and scientists and performance artists and experimental plumbers, and that maybe that conversation, you could curate the people around the events as important as curating the events themselves. Secondly, I had kind of an expansive idea of what an artist was, which was people who did interesting things that could be presented or interrogated in an art context, and not interested in fighting a battle about the definition of art, because everything is, and we all kind of are down with that, but taking it as the defined context from the start, that art was a place where you could look at any kind of human practices. And then thinking about what kind of resources you needed to allow these two groups to come together, to bring together different ideas and to do my fascinating job of trying to raise money for it to happen, and that these could then present things that would go out into the world, and you could form a kind of very simple research loop where you would think up an idea with an artist, you would iterate it out into the world, and then you might reflect back on it. And that reflection might mean making a video about it, or publishing a book, or the artist, now that they've done their messy, experimental, disastrous first version, could then do it in a museum and everybody be like, oh, it's so finished, it looks great. So the kinds of things we do range from kind of long-term projects to one night or one-off events. So the one-off events might be like, this was a project I did with artist Emily Lacy where we had a raffle, and the winner of the raffle got a free dental cleaning and simultaneous concert with my dentist, Dr. Perry T. Wong. If anybody needs a good dentist, he's like there's something very, he's nice, there's something very mournful about him though that I like. It makes me feel safe. A workshop for mothers and their daughters to learn how to break into cars and to hotwire them. So using, and this is something I do a lot, I'll use like a ridiculous premise as a way to dig into a deeper idea. So thinking about teaching, you know, electronics or mechanisms to children, it was interesting to have this kind of hook on top of it. A butter making aerobics class, an architectural tour of Wilshire Boulevard by the ghost of Whitney Houston, a mind reading workshop for the left and right brain. So for this, there was, oh, Asher Hartman's here, and Haruko Tanaka, who do Crystal Crunch, where they teach people to develop their psychic intuitive abilities, and then we built a lie detector. So sort of 2 ways of reading other people's subjectivities. Or an event we did last weekend where we had a live nude drawing class where it was all bugs, nude bugs, and then at the end we made protest signs for the bugs. So these projects are like one-offs, like one idea, it's almost like a sketch, it's like a proposal out into the world. But I have thought a lot about that idea of the ecosystem and what does it mean to build that. So one way that I think about it is actually very literal. Working with an artist to build an installation that then becomes a site for other artists to respond to. So I'm going to show a couple examples of those. So this was one by Sarah Newey and Christy McCaffrey, who were set designers and friends that I met in LA. And they had this idea of turning the gallery into a forest. So over the course of a period of time, we put up some prop trees and some real trees, and ended up with this kind of great, very realistic forest. And that was a very satisfying project in itself, but then what we did is invited other artists to respond to it. So we had, at midnight, we had done some lighting design, so it looked like the moon was coming out, so we would have like moonlight poetry readings, or we had bird watching where these birds would fly out and we had someone who knew about birds talking about them, or we served a pancake breakfast to people in the neighborhood where we had maple syrup taps in the tree. or a photo studio where you could bring your children in to be photographed in nature. Something that I really love about this space is that it's very porous with the street. So one of the challenges of working in museums, or like even in this room, right? To be at this talk, you kind of have to know the talk's happening, you have to make it into the school, there's all these sort of transitions. And what's great about the storefront is it's just a glass window and a door. So people wander in all the time. So I worked with an artist, Nate Page, who got really interested in this idea and wanted to make a piece about that transition point between the outside and the inside. So he took our front window and simply moved it back 30 feet. And I studied with Michael Asher at CalArts, so I loved this piece as a sort of really simple but kind of profound intervention. So that most of the gallery was outside, and it was sort of like this poking in of the outside world into the gallery. And this really strange effect happened, which was, if you were on the street or you kind of walked into the volume, it looked like the people working inside were like a diorama of storefront art workers. But the further you got in, the more you became kind of an animal in the zoo for us inside this space. So there's this great tension point where you would go from being sort of the subject to the observer. And then we did a variety of performances which played with these dual spaces. So whether it was having a concert on the inside and the outside at the same time, or on Christmas, we had Juliana Snapper, who's an opera singer, doing these crazy Christmas opera songs just on the street. Another project along these lines was with an artist, Josh Beckman, where he built a boat that filled the whole gallery, like it was sinking into the space. I like to think of it as like that movie, The Fly. Like this poor boat had been doing its business and then teleported and stuck in the middle. And then that became a kind of set for other things to happen. So we had the kids from the neighborhood come in and shoot a pirate film. I worked with Elizabeth Klein, who was a collaborator of mine from The Hammer, on this opera for dogs, where the storyline was this dog of like high society had fallen in love with this poor sailor, and because of like the like the social mores of the day, it was kind of this forbidden love, and so they left together. And then their boat promptly sank. And so the whole opera is like their dying romantic kind of moment together. There were some mermaids. Oh, there's the ending, so sad. So we have these things that happen in the space. And what's nice about it is that because I rent it, we can just continually transform it. But increasingly, we've been thinking about things happen in context outside of there. So for the book fair last year, we worked with this artist, Sarah, who designed an artist book library, where she had collected books by artists from Minneapolis. She had originally done this in a lake in Minneapolis, and then artists from LA. And then we had a floating platform where you could come and paddle up and check out a boat and kind of float around. So some of this idea of an ecosystem is not only building one, but then thinking about what are existing ecosystems. So if maybe this project is about machine as a petri dish that from time to time we cultivate with different things and see what grow in there. This is more about like being parasitic or being symbiotic, to looking at a cultural ecosystem and thinking about what part of this niche isn't occupied yet. If there's a lot of big sharks floating around eating tuna fish, maybe we can eat some algae, or maybe even better, we can eat the small little bloody chunks of tuna fish that fall down after the sharks consume them. And I think that this is an important thing to think about regardless of what your scale is, which is what is your role in the ecosystem. And I think a lot of times in the art world, we like to think of ourselves as really independent. Like, we have this idea, nobody thought of it before, or we're going to own this part of the space or that part of the space. And I feel like our ability to sustain ourselves has been about looking for where those shifts are and where those moments are. And because I like working with artists at the beginning of their projects, and I like working with them before their things are figured out, it's really good for my relationship with institutions, because I do the kind of crappy, disastrous versions, and then they can work from there. Hello, Michael. How are you? There's a seat right in the front. Oh, that's okay. I'm sorry. It was more happy to see you. I didn't mean to sound scolding. So that idea of like what hasn't happened in a space or what hasn't happened in a context we recently did a project at the Annenberg Beach House pool where it was a show where the whole installation was underwater. So you could swim around and check out the artworks. It's Emily Joyce. Johnson Mark Lee had designed this house that's on the Malibu beach, so we produced this model of it. Bob Dornberger made a boat for people who didn't want to go in the water, so it has like a glass bottom. If you've ever been in Florida looking at fish, maybe familiar. I don't have a slide of this, but this is a good story. I'm going to tell it to you. You know that David Hockney painting, A Bigger Splash? It's like a really iconic thing. I thought, oh, it'd be so great to have like a David Hockney in this show. And since I couldn't probably get it as a loan, I just got a copy. You know, you can send off, and there's factories where they make paintings. So I sent it off, and I got this giant David Hockney painting. I was like, oh, this is going to be great. And then the pool said, well, you can't do it unless you get permission from David Hockney. So I kept emailing his studio, and in the end, I just had a painting of a salamander made. But now at Machine, we have this great painting. So if anybody ever needs to borrow a David Hockney painting, come to me. Our registrar is very forgiving. So these are sites that maybe are used by the public, but don't have a ton of cultural weight. And then we also do a lot of projects with institutions and with sites that have a different kinds of cultural weight. And what I think about is, are these sites useful for artists, and can they be seen in a new way for a public? So I'm always trying to think in a way where everybody gets something out of it. That it's not so interesting for me to think about as an institution as like an empty container, and it's not so interesting for me to think about working without any kind of restraint. So I like when the things cross-feed against each other. So this might be a project like the Gamble House Arts and Crafts building in Pasadena. Very interesting to work on because you couldn't touch anything or put a nail on anything or hang anything on anything. I learned also there's a taxonomy of bungalows. And this style of bungalow is called taxonomically an ultimate bungalow. So I worked with Jessica Cowley, who's a sign painter, and she made this sign. And then we worked with Patrick Ballard to hang like a 800-pound sculpture off the front. And the Gamble House's family crest is a crane and a rose. And so he had this idea of a portal through time and space, and that every night for 3 minutes, this strange bird would come through the portal and sing a quick opera song. So there are installations, and also thinking about how could performances happen in that space. So we had these really great closets where we had poets read poems to us, Douglas Kearney. Mary Fagot who's obsessed about Masonic stuff and had done a bunch of research about the house, had found these, or had these great Masonic costumes. So at some point during the night, this silent procession of kind of scary looking animals would come out and tap you on the shoulder, and if you followed them, they'd take you to a secret room in the house and do a secret ceremony you weren't allowed to tell anybody about. But also, the Gamble family were big art collectors, and I was really interested in the difference between what a space we see art in now is, which is usually a giant white wall, and then this very, you know, like this place with a lot of different kind of styles. So I curated different works into the house too. It's Emily Joyce, Ricky Swallow. I can't remember the next artist's name because my brain has fallen out of my head, so now I'm very ashamed. But Ian, do you remember? Laura Lee Pope, thank you. Please. Yeah. Well, I commissioned it from an artist. But go ahead with your question.
Yeah, so I guess the question has something to do with the role that you play.
Yeah.
I'm assuming you're going to talk about that at the end.
Yeah,
Did you
maybe.
want to just sort of, just kind of briefly touch on sort of you as an artist, you went to art school, you studied Cal Art, so like when you have something commissioned, how are you conceiving of your role in that creative process?
Yeah, that's a great question, one I actually probably would have forgotten to talk about, so thank you. It really depends. So I think first and foremost, I'm a fan and I want things to happen. So I figure out like what's the right thing for that context. And it depends on the artist. So some artists, like Asher Hartman, produces these plays. I'm really obsessed with the work. I think it's really important. And my job in the beginning is to make it happen. Find the money, find the place for it, and then maybe as it goes along, I might give a note or have an idea about it. Other times, I may have a very collaborative relationship with an artist. So I've been working with this poet, Joshua Beckman, on how poetry is read for 10 years, and we just think of ridiculous ideas together. So I did one where he and another poet were trapped under the floor of the gallery. I had one where we had 3 poets offshore in a sailboat at night. You could signal with a lantern. So there, and he has his own poetry practice independent than that. So it's almost like that's a practice that we share together, we collaborate on. So in the case of Jessica, I just really knew she was a great sign painter and just invited her to do something. I wanted a big sign on the front, but she did all the research on seeing it was kind of the ultimate bungalow. But there was another piece where we had Asher do a psychic reading of the house. That was an idea that I thought up with a filmmaker, David Fenster, and then we just asked Asher to do it. So it's a little bit like the way, like some of your friends, if you call them on the phone, you're like, why are you making a phone call? That's crazy, text me. Other people, it's like, they won't pick up their texts, but if you contact them on like, if you send like a naked picture of yourself on Snapchat, they'll call back and say, what's wrong with you, you know? So everybody has like a different way, and I think my relationships are very wide there. And it comes from a kind of pragmatism of wanting to make stuff happen.
Are there any downsides to that kind of seemingly boundless way of producing? I mean, do you run into authorship issues with collaborators? I mean, where's the tension?
Yeah, yeah. Well, the authorship thing, the key to making it work is for me to forefront, you know, like to forefront the artists. When we're presenting the project, it's not Joshua Beckman and Mark Allen's poetry thing, it's Joshua Beckman. And the reason for that is that they're in a much more vulnerable position than me because our organization has a lot of identity. So what I do is I try to forefront the artist's identity in the individual projects, and then my identity appears in contexts like this or a little bit more behind the scenes. I think the disadvantages of it are that sometimes you make a really ridiculously disastrous project, but because I'm interested in a long-term engagement with artists and their practices, that's not actually a problem for me. So I can't always say like the thing is gonna work and be great, but I'm okay with that because that's the part of the practice I'm invested in. And then the other thing is it just takes more kind of time and energy. But I found it very rewarding. I guess one of the things is that it makes my practice super local. It's very hard for me to work out of town unless I can get an institution who's willing to fly like 30 people, you know? And I think in terms of the ecosystem or I really like to bring my biome with me. And part of that is because I think machine project things only really make sense in context of other machine project things. When they happen in LA, they make sense because it's one thing after another thing and people have seen other things. When I travel to somewhere else, I have to have everything happening at the same time for it to work. So I don't have a big international career because I may just be a terrible artist or curator, but also may be like, I can't get anybody to fly 30 people, you know, to Japan, which would be great. Also, anybody has questions during it, I'm happy to field it during. So thank you for asking a question. Appreciate that. Pictures. Oh, this is kind of cool. Sandeep Mujahari, who works with me at Pomona, made this using all Procter & Gamble products, and the Gamble house was owned by the Gamble family. So it's on what's that plastic material that's like, Emily? Mylar, thank you. So it's on Mylar, but then he put pigment down and then using rubbing alcohol and Q-tips, like gradually removed the painting material. So I like that callback. Using the furniture, both for showing sculptures and then for like bedside conversations. So in that case, it's like, what does this house want? Like, nobody's been in those beds in like 100 years. If I can convince them, maybe that would be kind of fun for the house and for the people who normally go to the Gamble house to see it in a different way, and also like an excuse for me to buy a pair of pajamas and kind of all that stuff. In the case of museums, and I've done a lot of work in museums, the needs of the institution are super site specific. So in the case of a project that we did at LACMA, it was 60 artists doing 1 day of projects, everybody doing it at the same time. And there, I saw my job as twofold. One was to activate the museum in a way that back then really hadn't been done that much in 2008, but also to bring together all of these disparate practices in LA who weren't kind of maybe an earlier idea of institutional critique, like not a much more sloppy and kind of funny idea of institutional critique, and artists who weren't necessarily gallery artists but were interested in making objects. So like this is a project that Liz Glynn did where she had volunteers make antiquities out of paper mache, and then we tried to smuggle them back into the museum. This was a project by Holly Vasecki where her and volunteers remade this Sam Francis painting out of live flowers over the course of the day, and then people would take the live flowers at the end of the day home. And I like this project I'm going to tell you about is one of my favorite examples of how simple context shifting can actually be kind of effective. So this was a project by Emily Lacy. And what she did is she just found folk songs from the year that these different modernist paintings were made, and then just stood in front of them and sang the songs. And I love this as taking two cultural threads, right? Like we know music of that period really well, and we know that art really well, but you never really think of like, what was Frank Stella, playing on the record player at the time. And this idea of like an individual responding to a museum or an individual experience at a museum is something that I've worked with a lot. This was a project at the Hammer Museum. I hate those audio tours. I hate the way it's like everybody has a parasitic. Do you know in that like second Star Trek movie where there's like the thing that goes in the guy's ear and takes control of his brain? It's like a deep cut only Ian is into. So I had this idea of like an audio tour, but that you would check out a guy instead of checking out like a piece of hardware. So you would check out this guy, and then he would walk behind you in the museum playing music based on like what you were looking at. And there's also this idea that I think about a lot, which is multiple audiences for participatory work. So that you would have the woman here who's getting the tour actually can't see the guitarist, is kind of in her own zone, but is making this strange like spectacle of herself during the show. And this idea of a triangulated audience was something that I worked with a ton on this plant vacation piece. So for this piece, I invited whoever wanted to bring their houseplant to the museum for a vacation. So over the course of a month, the plants would live at the museum on the beautiful sunny terrace, and then we would have performances that were just directed at the plants. So psychic readings and music, and Lisa Ann Auerbach came and did portraits of all the plants. And so there would be this idea that you were outside, but maybe you were trying to be part of that, or you're trying to connect with that audience or something like that of the plants. Oh, we also did this thing where I had a rock with a speaker on it connected to a phone. So if you missed your plant at home, you could call it and talk to it. And halfway through the show, this great thing happened where this guy contacted me from San Francisco, and he was like, I make pornography for plants. Can I be part of your show? Okay. So what he does is he does very high contrast films of honeybees pollinating plants. And so he would project it onto the plants at night when no one was in the museum. We also did a lot of different projects for people who worked at the museum. So we had Get Your Portrait with Your Dog Day. And then thinking about also not only the artwork in the museum or the people who work in the museum, but also what's the context around it. So at the Walker, we did this project where we had like ambient music in the parking garage. So thinking of like a part of the museum that people don't normally interact with, or the front lawn of the museum. This is, we took the 2 sheep, we rented sheep, and then we had them chewing on the lawn and mowing the lawn, and then miking the sound of the sheep. I've also been really interested in science projects a lot. So we did one recently where we had 300-year-old ice. I don't know if you guys know. The way that they measure like CO2 in the atmosphere is by digging these super deep cores. So they have these ice cores, and you can get ice that's like 1 million years old. And so we had this guy come talk about the ice, and then we served 300-year-old ice. You could get your ice with 300-year-old, 3-day-old, or no ice. This was a workshop where children turned melons into musical instruments. I'm also interested in this idea of like characters and characterization. So for this project, I worked with Juliana Snapper again, who did the project with the piano on Christmas. And the idea of this one was called Opera Listens to You. So it's sort of thinking about opera as a character who's like a super needy friend, right? Like opera is always about opera's drama and what's opera thinking about. And so for this, we had 8 opera singers who would surround people in the gallery, and then the people in the gallery would talk to the opera singers about what their problems were. And the opera singers would use kind of like active listening and then talk back to them, so it would show that like opera really cared. You know, like opera is really listening. We've done a lot of music things. I also love cutting holes in the floor. I don't know if you guys saw that image at the beginning of the talk where it had like that long map of the floor. So something that we did for a recent book was to track every single hole and trapdoor. I think a lot too about what are kinds of workshops that would connect different audiences. So for this project, what we did is we had a CPR workshop where we had all French people and a CPR instructor, and then in the back we had like analog synths, so you know, like when people plug them in. So they would create like, the sound of the heartbeats and the bodily organs. And we also work a lot with projects in people's homes. So I did a whole project
you're a beautiful
in San
crowd.
Francisco,
Thank you very much.
With Courtney Fink, where over the course
You know, it's
of
been
30
so long
days,
since
we
we've been here in
paired
Southern
30 San
California. You know,
Francisco
the last time
artists
we were
and
here,
30
we played
LA
at
artists with
Fuddruckers, and then
30
we took a
people's
trip
homes.
over to
So some
Mandarin
of
Lane
these
over in
were
La
a piece
Cienega.
we did with
and
Asher.
It's a crazy
here
town,
in LA,
and
and
I'd like to
also
thank
in
everybody
Miami.
for coming in today.
Um,
You know, I want to do a next
did a
song that's going to
project
be pretty revelation for us.
that
It's a
was
song
part
that I've
of
loved for so
Getty
long,
Pacific
and
Standard Time show,
along with my friend Miss
where
Rebecca here on
we
the
did
piano,
30
we'd like to
projects
perform
that
for you.
responded
Give it up for Miss
to
Rebecca.
architecture in LA. So this was the jeepneys responding to a bowling alley. For this project, what we did is we had, it was called Odyssey.
You make me feel so young. You make me feel like spring has sprung. And every time I see you grin, I'm such a happy individual. The moment that we sleep, I want to go play hide and seek. I want to go and bounce the moon just like a toy balloon. You and I were just like a couple of tots running across the meadow, picking up lots of forget-me-nots. Oh, you make me feel so young. You spring has sprung, words to be sung, and a wonderful zing to be sung. Oh, you make me feel so young. You make me feel so young. You can look at me, it's fine. You make me feel like spring has sprung. How are you? Looking good. And every time I see you grin, I'm dancing all alone. Nice tattoo. You and what's all right? Just like a couple of dots. Make me feel so young. You make me feel like a planet young. Picking up lots of forget-me-nots. You make me feel so young. Thank you. We massacred that song very nicely. I appreciate it. Don't be afraid. It's just music. We need all the music we can get. You know, I just want everybody to let you know that you're very special to me. And Miss Rebecca and I have been traveling this great state far and wide. I love being here in Lost Strangles. And I just want to let you know that you are each individual people, and I love you all. And never forget that you're different from one another. That's what makes you special. You are you. Remember, nothing compares to you. It's been 7 hours and 15 days since you took your love away. I go out every night and then I sleep all day. Since you took your love away. Since you've been gone, I can do whatever I want. I can see whomever I choose. I can eat my dinner in a fancy restaurant. But I said nothing can take away these blues. Because nothing compares to you. It's been so lonely living without you here. Like a bird without a song. Nothing can stop these lonely tears from falling. Tell me, baby, where did I go wrong? I could put my arms around every boy I see, but it would only remind me of you. I went to the doctor, and guess what he told me? He said, you know, Bobby, why don't you try to have some fun? No matter what you do. He's a fool, because nothing compares to you. You've been a great crowd. Thank you so much. Big hand for Miss Rebecca. I'm Bobby Coupon. Thank you so much. We love you all.
Fun thing, but then underneath becomes a way to deal with different kinds of ideas. So great. So that's my talk. I think we have a little bit of time. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I went a little bit long, but I think I have time for questions if people have any. Yes, in the back.
Are all of your lectures this immersive?
Oh, yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. So I started Michigan in 2003, And previous to that, I had been involved in an organization called Sea Level, which was like a collective of different artists in Chinatown. And part of the motivation for wanting to have the space was this idea of porosity that I was talking about earlier. That the Sea Level space is kind of amazing. It's like this basement, and you walk down to it, but you have to know about it, kind of like this talk. And what I loved about the storefront is you would just walk by, and something would be going on it. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, go ahead.
How did you start on this journey of discovering? Like, I find your language to be very proficient in the curiosity of art and the experience of it. How did you develop this skill set?
Talking about it, or like how I approach curating?
Both. Like, so, I mean, obviously, this came from a place of experience for yourself. Like,
Yeah.
It must have been something that triggered for you, like, to think that this is something you wanted to produce for the community.
Yeah.
So what was that impetus?
Yeah, I mean, I think for like any practice, it develops and kind of evolves over time. So in undergraduate, I made paintings and drawings, and I actually still do that. And after school, I moved to the core program, which is a residency in Houston. And previous to that, I grew up in like northern Vermont, and I went to a little liberal arts college, and I think I'd been to New York City once. Like, I'd never been to a city before. So my idea of what art was, and also like if you go to a liberal arts college, like in the far north of the United States in like 1989, you're learning about art from like 1750. So I really had this idea that like artists made their stuff, and then some mysterious guardian angel brought it to a museum, and then you got to go to a dinner party. But in Houston, I met these really interesting guys, Sean Ford and Chris Ballou, who did this itinerant curatorial project called Arena Productions. And they invited me to be in a show in a Sears department store. And every artist got one refrigerator to put their drawings on. And they had an opening on a Friday when people were just shopping for refrigerators. And it kind of blew my mind, because half the people were looking at refrigerators, and half the people are looking at art, and everybody's looking at the same thing, and they're having really different experiences, right? And that's like one of the most interesting and messed up things about humans, and where a lot of our problems come from. So I got really interested in this way of how could you approach different subjectivities or different subject positions, and how was art a way to do that, and also what was a fun way to do it, because I'm interested a lot in ideas of accessibility in very direct ways. So if I'm dealing with esoteric content or things like that, how do I make that accessible to people? I have a storefront that you can see in, and I say, hey, come on in, have a cookie. I make things funny or easy or entertaining, or I work with the idea cake kind of concept. So I first got the idea there, and there I started a space called Revolution Summer, which was kind of an economic experiment where all the work was for sale for the length of time it took to make. So if it took you an hour to make this, you could work for the artist for an hour. If it took 100 hours, you'd work for the artist. And it was kind of these elaborate, weird play dates where I got all the collectors in town to like mow the lawns of all the artists and stuff like that. But I would say I've done 1,500, 2,000 events. So it's just like any practice. You do it enough, you kind of get ideas about it. And then talking about it just from practicing talking about it. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, in the back.
How talked about computer programming in your old job.
Yeah.
How has that affected your practice?
Great. So it's actually affected in a lot of profound ways. When I was at graduate school, I worked in the animation department tutoring people on computer programming, and there I got really interested in how do you make something that's confusing and frustrating accessible to people. And that was kind of my path towards becoming a teacher. And then from a curatorial perspective, in the beginning of Machine, we did a lot of stuff around technology. And I was very interested in how our world is so constructed with technology, but it seemed very inaccessible to people. And so part of my mission was to make that more accessible. My own personal practice and interests, I went through a trajectory that I've seen a lot, which is you start being interested in software, and then you get interested in hardware because you can make things move. And then you get interested in plants because they're kind of unpredictable. And then you get interested in people because they're the most complex thing. So right now I'm really interested in people. I'm not so interested in technology, but I had that kind of trajectory. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Any other questions? You looked like you're about to ask a question, but then you thought better of it.
You had a slide on the difference between talk and workshop, but I couldn't hear so well what you were saying.
Oh, I was just saying that they're just different, depending on how you're presenting ideas, there's different modalities how information flows. And that we sort of think about culture in general as the workshop model on the left, that there's an artist who spews it out to an audience. But actually, I believe brain thinking is fairly communal. And so I think actually most culture production is more like the workshop, where we are receiving information, but we are also communicating between each other. I mean, even plants do that. Like trees will send pheromones out to other trees when they're being attacked by insects and stuff like that. Thank you for the callback. Yeah. Yes. You.
Yeah. You mentioned your process as, you used the word coming up with ridiculous ideas or something.
Uh-huh.
There's definitely a level of unfamiliarness and humor, I guess.
Uh-huh.
But it also feels very educated. I guess, could you talk a little bit about the balance between kind of these, I mean, you're obviously very smart.
Oh, thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about the balance between kind of the thought process becoming before premeditated and then kind of after?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just like I was talking with Edgar a little bit about different relationships to different artists. I also have different relationships to different ideas. So sometimes you just think of something and it's funny and then you do it. Other times you have a kind of idea you want to explore and you need to build a little bit of icing kind of on top of it. But I think I'm like a lot of artists where I just stumble forward doing things intuitively and then later the ideas kind of reveal about it. So I was talking a little bit about the houseplant vacation and this idea of an overheard utterance, which is sort of an idea from poetry, of a interactive audience where you're not the audience, where you're observing the audience, and that has to do with what the limits of our empathy are and dramatizing that. If we think about a plant as the sort of the liminal edge of anthropomorphization. Like I can feel like my plant has feelings and my plant's sad. I don't really feel like my notebook is sad because my handwriting is sloppy. So in that case, but first I had this idea of just bringing a lot of plants to the museum because I like plants and that would be nice. So you start with kind of a need or an interest or a way to engage people, and then as you develop it, the idea is you enrich in it and you try to get to the conversation that's happening underneath. And I think, but that's not unique to me. I think every artist does that. Like you make a thing and then 5 years later you're like, oh, now I get why I did that, right? So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah? Okay, thank you. I don't know, you want to do one more question? I don't know how you guys normally do it. Yes, sir.
How do you compare what you do to stand-up comedy?
I mean, of course, we're in like a cultural moment, right, where the borders between those are very fluid. And there's artists like Patrick Ballard, who I work with a lot, who really sort of does both, or like Cliff Hanks, who we saw in the very beginning doing the Whitney Houston architectural tour. But I think that in my case, I often use that, well, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't have a great answer. I think it's just some similar strategies in a different context, right? So I am, despite the fact that I'm interested in non-art audiences, I'm interested in non-art artists, I'm interested in the context of art and the history of art and the conversation of art and what questions about society and culture art lets us ask. I think that's the only difference. I think just as you could take a stand-up comedian, put them in an art context, you would ask different questions about that comedy act. That's how I would differentiate them, the context in which I swim in. Yeah, thank you. Okay, great. Thank you, guys. That was super nice to be able to talk to you. Thank you. Oh, can I give 2 plugs? Cliff Hanks, who's that artist I mentioned at the beginning with the Whitney Houston thing, and Asher Hartman, who's here, made an incredible play, which is really, in a deep and abstract way, about being an artist that we did at the Tang Museum last fall, and I'm really excited we're going to do it at Hauser and Wirth, March 3, 4, 5. So I've produced 7 of Asher's plays, and the tickets always sell out in the first day, and then my life is hell because all my friends are like, why didn't you save me a ticket? So sign up for the Machine email list right now. Our website is machineproject.com, and you will be the first to know about tickets for that. And then the other thing, all last year I've been producing with Kimberly Varela. She designed it, the Machine Project, the Platinum Collection, which is a complete archive of our work, all 250 posters we've ever done, how-tos, everything you'd ever want to know about Machine. And we're having a launch event for this at the Vista Movie Theater March 30th, which will be a free event. I don't know if you've ever been to the Vista, but it's a beautiful space. There'll be films made by Ian Byers-Gamber and live performances, and probably a weird giveaway and more of me doing this awkwardly. So please come to that March 30th. But in general, machineproject.com is your source for all Machine Project news. Thank you and good night.